Today, we're diving into one of the most powerful and honestly controversial books in political history, Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. It was written in a time of total chaos, and it poses this really tough question that we're still grappling with today. What are you willing to give up to feel safe?
So right off the bat, Hobbes hits you with this pretty wild idea. Forget all that stuff about the soul or some divine purpose. For him, a human being is just a very complex machine. The heart, that's just a spring. The nerves are strings, the joints are wheels. And look, this isn't just him being poetic, it's the bedrock of his entire political philosophy. Because if a person is a machine, then a state can be an even greater artificial machine, built for one specific purpose.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the world of fear that shaped Hobbes's ideas. Then, we'll get into the problem he saw in human nature itself. Third, his really radical solution. Fourth, the pretty steep price of that solution. And finally, we'll ask what his 400-year-old bargain means for you and me today. Okay, so to really get Leviathan, you have to understand the fear that created it. Hobbes wasn't just chilling in a peaceful library thinking deep thoughts. No. He was writing this in the middle of a brutal, chaotic civil war. I mean, look at this. Hobbes's entire life was basically bookended by conflict. He had this famous line that his mother gave birth to twins, himself and fear, because she went into labor when she heard the Spanish Armada was approaching England. He spent more than a decade in exile in Paris because he fled England right before the Civil War ripped the country to shreds. He saw up close and personal what happens when authority just collapses. So for Hobbes, this wasn't an academic exercise. Civil war was the absolute worst thing imaginable, and stopping it, that became his life's mission. So what did Hobbes think was at the very root of all this chaos? Well, it all boils down to his pretty bleak, but weirdly logical take on human nature when nobody's in charge. So remember that whole human as a machine thing? Hobbes said that as machines, we're always moving, always driven by our desires, what he called appetites, and our fears, our aversions. And this creates, in every single one of us, this constant, restless, never-ending desire for power. And this isn't because we're inherently evil or anything. It's just logical. Power is how you get what you want and stay safe. And this desire, he says, it only stops when we die. Okay, so you've got a bunch of these power-hungry machines running around with no rules. What happens next? Hobbes says conflict. It's unavoidable. And it happens for three big reasons. First step, competition. We all want the same limited resources, so we're going to fight over them. Then you've got distrust. I'm worried you're going to attack me to take my stuff, so I'm just going to attack you first to be safe. And finally, there's glory. We fight over silly things, a stray comment, a funny look, to protect our reputation. Because our reputation, that's a form of power too. And all of this leads to his most famous and frankly terrifying conclusion. In what he calls the state of nature, where there's no government, no laws, no police, the natural result is a war of every man against every man. And he's clear, this doesn't mean we're literally fighting 24/7. It's the constant threat of it, the constant fear. In this state, nobody builds anything, there's no culture, no progress. The life of man, in his legendary words, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, so how do you get out of this nightmare scenario? Well, Hobbes has a way out, and it's a real stroke of genius. It involves all of us making a deal to create something entirely new, a kind of artificial God on Earth. The logic here is actually pretty straightforward, but it's incredibly powerful. The number one fear we all have is a violent death. That fear is what makes us rational. We realize that to get peace, we have to give something up, our right of nature, which is basically the freedom to do whatever we think we need to do to survive. So we all get together and agree to hand over that right to one single authority. Could be a king, could be an assembly. This collective act creates the Leviathan, a state with total, absolute power to keep the peace. So this is the core of the deal, right? The trade-off. On the one hand, in the state of nature, yeah, you have total freedom, but it's a terrifying freedom in a world of constant fear where you can't build anything that lasts. On the other hand, you create this sovereign, you give up that chaotic freedom, and in return, you get security, you get laws, you get the safety you need to build businesses and create art, and you get a shot at a decent, comfortable life. It's a grim choice for sure, but for Hobbes, it was the only rational one. All right, so this sounds pretty good in theory, right? But what's the catch? What's the real price we pay for all this peace? What does life actually look like under this all-powerful sovereign? Yeah, the big one. If this sovereign has absolute power, are we all just slaves? What happens to our liberty? And Hobbes's answer here is, well, it's pretty slick. He just completely flips the definition of liberty on its head. He says, look, real freedom isn't the freedom from laws. It's the freedom from fear. The biggest, most important freedom you have is not getting randomly martyred by your neighbor. After that, your liberty exists in what he calls the silence of the law, all the areas where the sovereign just hasn't made a rule. You're free to pick your job, decide what to eat, where to live, as long as there isn't a law telling you otherwise.
And you see this exact same cold, hard logic applied to religion, which, remember, was a huge driver of the English Civil War. Hobbes' solution is almost clinical. Believe whatever you want in private. In your heart, your faith is internal and invisible. But publicly, your actions have to follow the sovereign's law, period. If your faith tells you to break the law, well, you can, but you have to accept the punishment here on earth and just hope you get your reward in heaven. What you absolutely cannot do is start a war over it.
All right, let's wrap this up. Let's put it all together. What is the final deal that Hobbes is offering, and why on earth are we still talking about it hundreds of years later? Okay, so this is it. The Hobbesian bargain laid out plain and simple. You give up your personal right to do whatever it takes to survive, and you give up your right to challenge the government. In return, you get security from a violent death, and you get a stable society where you can actually build a life. At the end of the day, it's a trade, an all-or-nothing deal. You can't have total freedom and total security. You have to choose. And that's what brings us right back to today. Because this is the question Leviathan forces every single generation, including ours, to answer. We argue about it every time we discuss government surveillance, or public health rules, or how much power the state should have. The terms of that bargain are still on the table. So I'll leave you with that. How much of your liberty are you really willing to trade for the promise of total security?